Hi everyone and welcome to our first episode of Away with the Pharaohs, a brand new podcast here at the Egypt Exploration Society. I'm going to be your host. My name is Charlotte Jordan. I'm the engagement manager and excited to dive into Egyptian cultural heritage, but hopefully in a way that you've possibly not heard before, or at least learning some new things along the way. And of course, Away with the Pharaohs, we've got to start our first episode with thinking about the pharaohs more. So I'm very delighted to have our first special guest, Aidan Dodson, with us today. So Professor Aidan Dodson has taught at the University of Bristol since 1996 and has been Honorary Professor of Egyptology since 2018. Undergrad from the University of Liverpool, which I also went to. So good shout out there.
As do all the best Egyptologists.
Well, of course. And an MPhil and a PhD from the University of Cambridge. And of course, I should mention that it's wonderful to invite Aidan back, as you were previously our chair.
Yes, back from 2011 and 2016 now.
Yeah, so brilliant to have you back in the building, although changed a little bit since you were here. However, we're sat here in the library, which probably looks very similar. Of course, you are a prolific writer with at least 30 books. That number might be out of date though. And the most recent being part of a series called Lives and Afterlives, which is focusing all about Egyptian pharaohs. So of course, this is why we're here today, to talk a little bit more about them. And this episode specifically is going to be talking about, were pharaohs pyramid scheme leaders or building a true legacy? And hopefully by the end of today's episode, we'll be able to answer that. So yeah, thank you so much, Aidan, for joining us and talking about this today. So I think first off, it would be great to talk a little bit about what is a pharaoh and the concept of kingship, and then we can move into why they needed tombs.
Okay. Well, first of all, it's worthwhile pointing out that the word pharaoh, we get from the Hebrew Bible. In Exodus and various other places, it's just used as a general term for the king of Egypt. It does actually go back to ancient Egyptian. There's a word or a term, Pharaoh, which means the great house. And that originally was simply a name for the palace. And for the first 1500 years or so of Egyptian history, that's all it was. But then around about 1500 BC, around that sort of period, we start finding it being used as a word for the king, very much in the same kind of way that we use the White House, the President of the USA, or number 10 Downing Street, Buckingham Palace, and all those things as a word for that. And then gradually it becomes a formal title as well, perhaps half a millennium, 500 years later, so that by the time we're after, say, 1000 BC, we start finding somebody being called Pharaoh so-and-so or Pharaoh so-and-so on the monuments. Now, the nature of Egyptian kingship has been debated a lot over the last couple of centuries by Egyptologists. It's clear that the king was divine in some way, but whether he was a god in our terms is slightly more problematic, because the Egyptian word which we translate as God, Necha, is actually a much broader term for divine. So there's things, the beings we would define as a proper God, somebody you actually worship. But there's also minor figures who never had a cult, are still Necheru gods. So the very fact that a king is quite clearly called a god doesn't necessarily mean he's a god in the way that the word God in English would define it. Nevertheless, it's fairly clear he has divine aspect to him. And by about sort of 1500 or so BC, there is a basic structure there about how somebody becomes a king. And the first part of that is to be the son of your predecessor, but crucially, at the moment of conception, your predecessor's body has been taken over by a god. So actually, you are simultaneously the child of your earthly father, the previous king, who of course has also got a bit of divinity in anyway, but also your other father is a deity. So that certainly implies that a king is at least half God in our sense, but but only a very tiny handful took it the further step to actually be worshipped themselves.
Very complex.
Very. Like most things to do with Egyptian theology, it doesn't fit neatly into the boxes that we were accustomed to do.
Of course. And yeah, we're going to learn a little bit more about how different Egyptian culture was to us today. But it's great to see some of those similarities as well. Like you were saying, the idea about the White House and 10 Downing Street as well with Pharaohs. And so this idea of the king being partly divine, does that lead into why he required a burial place that was quite important?
I think the question about how divinity and the way a king is buried tie together, in some ways, the king's burial is simply a bigger and better version of everybody else's, in the sense that you've got a burial chamber, you've sometimes got a monument over that, and then a temple or chapel for the interface. So that really, when you look at what you've got with royal tombs, in many cases, that's just a bigger and better version. However, when you start looking at the detail, things are a bit different, particularly insofar as the texts which are used in a royal tomb versus a private tomb, at least until we get quite late in Egyptian history where all bets are off effectively. But if we look at sort of the classic one of the New Kingdom, big handfuls, 1500 BC, down to what we're talking about, 1100, big handfuls. When you look at private tombs, and we're talking here about the actual burial chambers here, not the public chapels. If you look at the actual burial chambers of such private individuals as have decoration, it's taken from the Book of the Dead, which is the standard handbook to being dead.
Which we should say is not a literal book, but actually a collection of texts, often on papyri or possibly inscribed, of different spells that people could use.
Yeah, and where you have, on the very rare occasions, a burial chamber of a private individual is decorated, it's the Book of the Dead which is the main stuff on there. In contrast, royal burial chambers at the same sort of period in the Valley of the Kings are decorated with what we call the books of the underworld. And rather than being a guide for the dead person to get from death to resurrection through various trials and tribulations, culminating in a judgment, a king, the decoration of his tomb is the sun's cycle from sunset to sunrise. The sunset is regarded by the Egyptians as being equivalent to death and sunrise to rebirth. And it's that process which is on the walls of royal burial chambers, in which the king implicitly is participating, because except for one example right at the beginning of the sequence, the king doesn't appear at all in any of this. It's all happening around him. And so therefore that cycle of passing through the underworld and being reborn is then presumably the environment which allows the king himself to be reborn as well. And then we look at other evidence as to how the next world was regarded for the king. And for this, we have to go much further back to the time of the pyramids. In the pyramid texts, which are our earliest examples of texts helping the person. Here, the king is presented in a wide range of different ways, as the secretary of the gods, as a companion to the sun god. Even there's a rather bizarre one called the cannibal hymn, where he's hunting, killing the gods and eating them to get their power.
Oh, very strange.
Yeah, it's very, very. But what's interesting here is within this one group of texts, the pyramid texts, which are found in a number of pyramids, there are no two sets which are identical. But even within one particular pyramid, there may be half a dozen different conceptions about what the dead king gets up to when he's dead, which I think again reflects something about Egyptian mythology or theology, whereby you haven't got the kind of systematized thing you have in Judaism, Christianity, Islam. You've got something that's much more pick and mix.
Yes. And this is, what, about 1,000 years before those New Kingdom examples you were talking about?
Absolutely, yeah. And we have no indication of what the next world is like for the king once you get beyond the pyramid texts. All you've got is the fact that the king is sort of sitting there in this room surrounded by the whole death to resurrection. But there is a point a bit later on, during the Third Intermediate period, when, so to say, we say kingship has been diminished slightly, we actually start finding Book of the Dead creeping into royal tombs. And even in one of the royal tombs of King Azorkon II up at Tarnis, you even find his heart being weighed against the feather of truth to be allowed to. No previous king would go through something like that. You occasionally find the judgment hall on a tomb wall, but it's simply as part of the scenery of the sun god's nocturnal voyage. The king's not taking part in this. But then suddenly, I think it marks a sort of collapse in the confidence, I suppose, of kingship. We're now talking about 900 BC, 800 BC, when things are all going fairly horribly wrong for Egypt. And this is reflected by the fact he now has to go through what hitherto had been something really only for private individuals.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting concept to narrow down in, because that weighing of the heart scene is probably known by many of our listeners. Yeah, your heart on one end, the mart feather on the other, and possibly your heart will be eaten by the goddess Amunet. But yeah, is it only that one example?
Well, it's the only one which has survived. Although interestingly, Shoshenq III, who is slightly later, there's no sign of the weighing of the heart in his tomb. So whether it's something to do with the crisis of confidence by Azorkon II. And there's a text of his on a statue split between Philadelphia and Cairo, where he is sort of petitioning the gods. And he sounds a very worried man. He's talking about wanting to make sure all the big jobs in the country go to his children. But then he doesn't want them to start fighting over it, which all does rather suggest that's what's going on. So I just get the feeling of Azorkon II, a slightly neurotic guy who is just worrying about everything. And he may even be thinking, oh my God, am I good enough to be a god to go through? And hence, let's put the weighing of the heart in my tomb.
Perhaps, yeah. Shows that pharaohs were possibly just people like us.
Yes.
We'll be revealing more throughout the podcast, but it's so important to realise how much history the Egyptian civilization covers. Of course, with Azorkon II, we're thinking of more modern, I suppose. Not really, but
we're over 2,000 years into Egyptian history. You know, bearing in mind now that the pharaonic state comes in around 3000 BC, and so now we're talking about with Azorkon around 800. You know, more than 2/3 of Egyptian history has actually already gone by.
Yeah, and it's so interesting to see how those concepts change over time. And of course, yeah, as you said, the confidence in the king throughout that time varies in different, we have kingdoms, we have intermediate periods that all have different political situations, which we might go into a bit more. But yeah, it's fascinating history. Let's go back in time, shall we say, and think more about those pyramids and thinking about their monumentality and the importance of those towards those kings' reigns in earlier history.
Yeah, I think when you look at the pyramids, what's really interesting is the biggest ones are amongst the earliest to be built. And I've always taken the view that this was a case of the pharaohs and also their engineers simply seeing what they can do, because you move from the step pyramid, the first pyramid, which is just built of blocks of first major stone building ever built, but the blocks are basically the same size as mud bricks, which they'd been using previously. But they move quite rapidly in each generation to something bigger. So you're only talking about, just over a century from that first pyramid to the huge ones built by Snefru, Khufu, and Khafre. At which point then it drops off again. And I think what's happening there is that they're basically saying, this is what we can do. But then when you get beyond, you get to the Great Pyramid, and I think they recognise that's sort of as far as you can go. Yes. And what you then find after that is that the pyramids start getting smaller, but the temples adjacent to them get bigger and more elaborately decorated. And in fact, the last sets of pyramids in the Old Kingdom are pretty well all identical.
Yeah, I think a wonderful factor that tells us about the span of Egyptian history is that when the pyramids were being built in the Old Kingdom, there were still mammoths walking the earth.
Wow.
Yeah, quite incredible.
Yes.
Only in certain parts of the world,
yes.
but yeah.
But even so, yes, that overlap is quite something. And of course, the other thing is to bear in mind that when Cleopatra VII, the famous Cleopatra, was ruling Egypt, for her, the pyramids were older than Cleopatra is for us.
Yes.
And that's something which I always almost start quite a lot of lectures with. It's just bearing in mind how much time we're talking about here.
Yeah, of course, we're only going to be touching the surface with things today and in other episodes, but I think it's such a fascinating civilization, and I think that's why people gravitate towards ancient Egypt.
Go online now to sign up to our e-newsletter and ensure that the latest news gets delivered straight to your inbox.
Really interesting discussion so far, but let's talk a bit more about why pyramids exist.
Right. I think we've already said they are the tombs of kings, but why a big pointy thing on top of it? Well, of course, we don't know for certain. The trouble is there's so much of Egyptian civilization we've simply had to infer what it's all about because the texts don't tell us. However, I think with pyramids, we can certainly say they're a solar symbol. We know that the fetish of the sun god, Re, was either a pyramidal or conical stone. We have texts which make it clear it's a triangular thing, but whether that's pyramid-shaped or cone-shaped, we don't know. And there, on that basis, it's been suggested that the pyramid is indeed just a giant version of that fetish of the sun god. And there's a couple of things which sort of can support that. The solar idea, actually, if you're ever up on a pyramid plateau and it's a cloudy day and you can see the sun just breaking through the clouds, it's generally coming down in a cone, which really does replicate in many ways the typical angle of a pyramid. So I think one could even see the pyramid as petrified sun's rays. A further support, I think, to the idea that there's something to do with a solar belief is that around the time pointy pyramids come in is a point with a big upsurge in the citation of the sun god's name in royal names. So from the middle of the 4th dynasty onwards, every pharaoh has got the sun god's name in his name. And I think that coinciding pretty well with the heyday of the pointy pyramid, I think suggests that may well be part of it.
Yeah, definitely. I think especially that vision of that sun ray breaking through the clouds really gives you that reason why they could be solar symbols.
I think that's the best solution. Is the other thing about pyramids though is they are the most straightforward way of building something very tall.
Of course.
It's the reason why you have got the Mesopotamian ziggurats and so on are largely pyramidal, because until you've got things like steel-framed buildings and stuff, you can't build something very, very tall and narrow at the bottom. It's only when you can do, or when you're doing things like in the building of the cathedrals, but that's done in a different kind of way. If you're simply building something big and solid, a pyramid is about the only game in town. I think that's one of the reasons why I always sort of stop people when they talk about, well, there are pyramids in Central America, in Egypt. It's like, no. What you've got is square buildings with sloping sides. Using the P word implies there's something common about what they're for. You've just got to recognise that a pyramid is simply a geometric shape. And from an engineering point of view, in early engineering, it's by far the easiest way of building something big and tall. So we have to say that's the problem with, so we also really should be saying Egyptian pyramids,
yes,
American pyramids as completely separate units.
Yeah, triangular shapes are one of the most strongest architectural shapes.
Exactly, yes.
So yeah, it's difficult to decide whether it was just that reason or whether the symbolism was the most important. Of course, until we can step into a time machine, it's hard to know.
Yeah. And I would suspect that probably by the time they built 2 or 3 pyramids, nobody actually knew anyway.
True. Of course, we have the pyramids of Giza, which is probably most well known to people, and the largest of the 3 bigger pyramids at that site, I should say, is of course one of the only standing ancient wonders of the world as well, that featured on a lot of ancient wonder lists. How do you feel people have seen the pyramids back in ancient times and even more?
I think they've always been something which is just sort of massively in your face, and also they've been a sort of a tourist attraction throughout. Even in ancient times, we've got tourist graffiti from ancient Egypt on some of these pyramids locations. But from fairly early on, people looking from the outside, there's always this feeling they might be something more. And of course, that has led to, in modern times, all sorts of bizarre ideas about what the pyramids are. In fact, but half of it is seeing these things through a lens of your own time. Back in medieval times, the pyramids were seen as the granaries built by Joseph, as talked about in the Old Testament,
Yes.
Because that was something which was monuments to known of in Egypt, and then they put 2 and 2 together and made 6 in this particular case. And again, the idea that they are something largely practical is always difficult to try to get a handle on. And though people who don't understand sort of the Egyptian conceptions of solar belief and so on, which immediately leads Egyptologists down this line of what they actually mean, you have people who just have no understanding of any of that and will suddenly jump at almost anything. And then, of course, it leads to the sort of ancient aliens hypotheses, or the idea that these things are power plants. It was a tour guide in Egypt telling me, because of the way all the granite and limestone work together, the Great Pyramid can produce power. Sorry, where did that come from? But there's a whole. But the third point, there's so much in your face that people feel they have to be something more than just simply what they really actually are.
Okay, well, you've mentioned aliens, which unfortunately comes up a lot around pyramids, but maybe we should introduce why that's not a possibility and talk about what we know about how the pyramids were built.
Okay. As far as the building of pyramids are concerned, we unfortunately have no ancient text which tells us how they do it. But we can infer quite a bit from what we do know about Egyptian practice, and also from remains which are still present archaeologically. For example, we have a number of unfinished pyramids, and the remains of those unfinished pyramids are covered with ramps, clearly which are to be used to raise stones up to a particular level. And that does tie in nicely with some papyri, where they're talking about calculating ramp angles and so on. These are much later than the pyramids, but clearly it indicates that ramps are the way an Egyptian engineer gets anything up to a higher level. So we can take that fairly well as read. As far as the mechanics of it, who's doing these things, well, we have the barracks of at least 2 pyramid building teams. There's one set at Giza, near the Great Pyramid. There's also another one at Kahun, close to a Middle Kingdom pyramid site. So clearly we know that there are establishments of people who are doing this kind of thing. We also know where the stone comes from. Most of the stone comes from virtually next door to the pyramid itself. When you go to somewhere like Giza, you notice there's a huge hole, effectively, in between the 2 great pyramids, and that is where the stone came from.
Which makes a lot of sense.
Indeed. But there's also, of course, your more upmarket stone. There's going to be the fine quality limestone for the outer casing. There's going to be granite, basalt and other stones for paving and adorning the temples particularly. And those had to be brought in from elsewhere. The limestone from the outside comes from directly the other side of the river from pyramid sites. And here, what's really exciting was a few years ago, some papyri were found on the Red Sea in the Red Sea of all places, which included a ship's log of people who were actually carrying this limestone from one side of the Nile to the other. The Wadi Jaf papyri, which suddenly opens a whole new vista on our understanding of these things. And what's even more exciting is that these are actually the oldest written papyri ever found, and they're actually written by an eyewitness the building of the Great Pyramid.
It's quite incredible how, one discovery can change our understanding of history.
But it does show that where you get the evidence for, you wouldn't expect to find the evidence for the construction process of the pyramids on the Red Sea. But this happened, he was a boat captain. Some of his job was to take boats down the Red Sea. He also worked on the Nile. And so presumably they kept his logbooks with him, and they eventually ended up while he was working on the Red Sea. So that's an interesting sort of thing around there. And we can also infer stuff about how the process worked by looking at how later workmen are organised. Much later, we've got the village of Deir el-Medina, the people who build the Valley of the King's tombs. Now, of course, they're cutting underground passages, not building pyramids, but the organisation into teams and so on is all part of that. And that team structure is reflected by quarry marks, which we find on stones of pyramids, whereby it notes basically which team was responsible for moving that particular block. So all of this ties together so we understand that it's a huge project management task. And I think the key point to understand about building pyramids or anything else in ancient Egypt is that they were good project managers. And also the fact that when you see these structures, there's an evolution going on so that each generation learns from the last. And that's part of the Egyptian society, is whereby you did the job your dad did. Therefore, if your dad built pyramids, you did. And the point is that once you probably could toddle, you went off and sat watching your dad, your uncles, and everybody else building pyramids. So therefore, all those kinds of trade secrets, if you like, you just exactly know where you need to bang something so it will, all those kinds of things. So that's what you've got. You've got generations of people, and that engineering expertise is reinforced generation after generation after generation. And that's how it all works. But these, of course, are the skilled individuals. They are not going to waste their time moving just lots of raw materials. And although there's no doubt documentation which proves this, it's strongly suspected that the moving of using sort of the basic labour probably took place during the flooding of the Nile every year, when the fields were all covered with water, and therefore you had all the farm labourers were effectively unable to work for a number of months. It's strongly suspected that they were then conscripted to do the donkey work, almost literally. Or they were the ones who would be dragging blocks around so that when the waters went down and they could go and go back to the fields, all the blocks were in a location whereby the skilled labourers could then pick up and move them on. And another thing about the inundation is also it means that if you're bringing in the stone from outside, on the other side of the Nile from the point of view of the limestone, or from the other end of Egypt for granite and things like that, when the Nile has flooded, the river is going right up the edge of the desert. So therefore, you can actually, again, during that period, you're probably putting all effort into getting barges and so on up to the desert edge on that before the water goes down. So again, everything is ready. So the late summer, autumn is probably when all your stuff is being put into locations. And then over the winter on and into the spring is when the skilled labourers are getting on and doing it.
That's so interesting. And talking about those skilled labourers learning generational skills, I mean, that's reflected in Egyptian workers on archaeological sites today. So a lot of them have studied under their own fathers or grandfathers and continued to do archaeological skills rather than the engineering skills. But I mean, it shows how history repeats itself.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's the whole point. It's in learning, and that's one of the reasons why so many societies have you do the same thing your father. It's not part. It's partly social conservatism there, but it's simply how it works.
Yeah, you learn from your closest relatives most, don't you?
Yeah.
Very interesting. And of course, you talked about possible ideas about who are moving these blocks. So, counter to popular belief, we don't think it's slaves that built the pyramids.
Yeah. Of course, the big question of how you define slave. There's another little issue here.
Yes.
Because these people these farmers who, if they're conscripted to do this, probably didn't necessarily want to do that.
No.
So whether you could argue they are slaves in those days, but the point is they are not individuals who only do that and are being forced to do it. And it's a problem where we're just trying to impose a concept which is actually fundamentally sort of Roman, of slavery, and then how it's then been deployed in more modern times to try to use that word. And I think there's always a big problem with dealing with pre-modern civilizations is what words we use. I've already mentioned this whole question about what God means. There's one word in the Egyptian, Netcha, but for us that would cover everything from God, demon, saint, all those kind of things.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, it's so important to think about our own cultural biases at these points because meanings change so much over time. We mentioned earlier about the discovery on the Red Sea coast, about the movement of blocks from there. And I think that just shows how important continued excavation and research because not only archaeological discoveries, but also discoveries within libraries, archives can reveal just as interesting information.
Yeah. And in many ways, I think some of the most important discoveries in recent years have not been the sort of even sort of major digging things. They're simply keeping one's eye out for these things. Because these papyri were found in the back of a storeroom where they'd clearly been just left. And then they saw these bits of papyrus. And then one was picked up and it had got the name of Khufu, built a great pyramid on it. And suddenly that was a wow moment because this means they're the oldest papyri ever found and they may have something to do with Khufu. And when they put all that together, it produced a major bit of information like that. So when people ask me about what is the greatest discoveries, well, I say, Wadi Jar papyri, very definitely one of them. So to understand about the era which built the pyramids, for example, you've got to take the pyramids themselves. I'm just looking, that's the pointy bits. You also got to look at what's underneath them, the burial chambers. You've got to look at what the temples are around them. Then you've also got material from the builders, their settlements and so on. Also, as far as some of the pyramids are concerned, we've actually got remains of their archives of not the stuff that was going on when they were being built, but these places continue to be in operation for sometimes generations to look after the spirit of the departed king. And these people have archives. And these then tell us about the broader stuff about how funeral endowments worked. Because if you were, certainly a pharaoh would, but also other rich people would leave fields and other sort of resources to maintain their cults. So there'd be farms which would provide the meat and vegetables which would be offered to the deceased. And of course, those kinds of establishments have an economic impact of their own because they are something where they're employing people, they're producing food, because the food which is put in offerings, as far as we can tell, is sort of almost waved under the nose of the spirit and then is taken off to the kitchens to produce lunch for the priests. So there's and of course, having those kind of priesthoods may also be providing for craftsmen to maintain the pyramids, etc., etc., etc. So when we're looking at the beginning, our pyramid scheme, we were saying at the very beginning, the pyramid actually has tentacles which goes throughout society, both while it's being designed, it's being built, and then providing for establishments which look after it later on. In some cases, it's quite clear that those establishments don't last more than a generation. Other kings, however, have cults which carry on, possibly after interruptions. Like Snefru, the father of Khufu, who built 3 pyramids. In fact, he's the greatest pyramid builder of a whole lot of them. There's cult of his still going on in Ptolemaic times. 2,500 years after his death. So these things are not just simply a certain small period. Some of these pyramids continue to have influence today. And if one wants to sort of stretch things even further, that the fact the pyramids are the basis for a huge tourist industry in Egypt today, so that Khufu's investment nearly 4,500 years ago is paying off for his ultimate successors, the modern presidents of Egypt.
We can see right now they're building new entrances and pathways to the pyramids. The largest museum in the world, the Grand Egyptian Museum, which is still, as we speak, only partially open.
Yes.
But a brilliant institution to show so much of Egyptian cultural heritage. And you can see the pyramids from the museum.
And on a more basic level, it's providing jobs for modern Egyptian workers.
Yeah.
So again, when people sort of look at the pyramids as being sort of monuments to sort of folly and grandeur, actually, they probably in their own time, they were major economic stimuli for the country. And some have argued that it was that part of the massive scale of the early pyramids was to make them a genuine national enterprise, so that people, even if you're living down in Aswan, you are contributing something to the whole thing. And then as you then move on through history, they're quite clearly tourist attractions in ancient times. As we were just saying, that as we move on now, they're still an important economic building block for modern Egypt.
Yeah, that brings us nicely to our overall episode question again, as you alluded to. Yeah, were pharaohs pyramid scheme leaders or building a true legacy? And I think it's both in a way.
To some degree. But I think, again, we're talking about icons. A pyramid and Egypt are synonymous. So again, the links and the continuing ties between the ancient and the modern are really, really there. So yeah, maybe a pyramid scheme, but probably a positive one.
Yes. What a great way to end. And just like to take this opportunity to thank you, Aidan, for such a fascinating discussion we've been through. Quite a lot today, and a brilliant way to kick off our brand new podcast. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.